Hello everyone, today we talk about the overestimation and underestimation of anybody's historical understanding rather than knowledge in itself and or expertise specifically, which is a topic that we have already addressed indirectly sometimes, but I thought this could be interesting for a number of reasons. Not really how to, of course there is a lot of how to spot this, let's say, but also why, right, we need to do this. This is what is about these two attitudes, right? Literally overestimating and underestimating, and we know that in reality we fall either in one or the other, right? There is no attainable, golden medium in that, and truth and absolute precision. So we always end up to do this, right? And we do it with ourselves, by the way, or at least in relation to ourselves, because that's at the end of the day what the thing unavoidably is. At the same time, we are the ones who express such judgments. You would say, but why should you express that judgment? Well, because frankly, the world cannot exist without human interaction. Human interaction is fundamentally based on this. It's what you essentially think about other people, whether or not, right? And I know that many people do not really like this idea, right? The idea that somewhat we are always judging one another, right? And that there is and that there is factually nothing bad in it, right? Or at least, and it can be as good as bad, right? Depending on what and the, which is also relative, in the accuracy of our assessment, let's say, because of course, and we have addressed this problem many times. Of course, first of all, it's not very fashionable to even talk about anybody's historical competence as an average topic, right? Unless we don't want to, in fact, to say, oh, look, this person is an ignorant, like, a politician says something particularly stupid, or we realize somebody has literally no idea of the past, etc. But that's exactly, in a way, what matters for everybody, right? At the same level, for all the reasons that we have explained about the importance of history in our world and why we should essentially, and the word, in the same word, would be a much better place if we all had a greater historical understanding, not just a greater, economical understanding or juridical understanding or chemical understanding. It's history encompasses basically any kind of knowledge in relation to each other, right? So that you can study history of engineering without being an engineer. You can study history of philosophy without being, let's say, a philosopher. Whether another hot topic would have come up with in some of these videos, talking about philosophy, what it is, what it is important, right? What are its pros and cons, or at least what's my living experience with that, because I still have okay, that's not really important, but it has to do with this too, right? Don't think that it doesn't encompass this broader scientific problems. At the end of the day, we are presented with all the time. So there is naturally a lot of egoism in this vision of, say, putting yourself mostly in comparison to others to essentially affirm and validate and even simply measure, right, yourself in a way. And I don't think I have a particularly great ego myself. I'm mostly an arrogant, ambitious, and sometimes absolutely a not diplomatic person. I got myself almost in trouble on many occasions in my life because I have the pretty pleasant habit of saying straight to the face of things, that everything I think, basically. Of course, I can't treat people with decency, but if they are what I think, decent people. So as you understand, I have my opinion on a lot of things. I judge a lot. I share that I'm a pretty judgmental person myself, and this, in fact, did create problems to me for the aforementioned reasons. History, as I was just saying, is not just about, you see, you would say you are a historian, so obviously you want to validate yourself on the basis of what you have studied, what you have learned, what your profession is. Believe me, not much in that sense. Of course, I'm I'm legitimately proud of certain things I achieved, but let's say I hardly ever talk about them here. Even when I started now the PhD Tales series, that was essentially to explain how certain things work and how to functionalize your research, all these things. I never actually said I'm proud of having done this or having written that or having said this to a person, to have behaved in that way. As you know, you don't know even where I am, where I come from, and all these things. So, but I reject this idea for the simple reason that I'm often disgusted. In fact, I have a pretty negative judgment and attitude towards other historians, right, and other people who claim to have any other specific competence or of expertise, and that fall always dramatically short of expectations. I like to stay, down to earth relatively to these things. I don't see titles per se. You see, I could boast that I'm a doctor, so I could say, I use this to pretend that doctors are good, right? Because I am one, right? Not quite. Right, of course, and part of my pride does stem from the fact that I have standards, right, and part of these standards are reflected by even such achievements, such level of scientific, kind of academic, international recognition, all these things. But the more I have expanded my knowledge and understanding on what I see around in the world, and in a very close world, and in many fields, right, including even these popular ones, I have great doubts that we are creating actually truly competent people in the way we should have in terms of real standards, I believe, and not just scientific ones, but moral ones, right? For example, I'm a historian who spends a lot of time, as you understand, making these YouTube videos and waiting for this thing to grow a little bit more. Now, as you know, I re-upload the old stuff. I cut a bit of algorithmic flux, so the thing is slowed down a little, but it's all normal. Let's say that was to make the channel move on because of the the images issues and the licenses and so on. But I see like even just by I don't use social networks more than much, meaning that I don't spend much time on them. Right. So, but the few ones I have some, I connect to, or are obviously, I like in the past, right? Because now I don't even have an interest properly in such things. I liked pages, all things that could present me every time I open the thing with a stream of posts, etc., that are history related. And it's obvious that social networks culture is not really exemplificative of what any kind of scientific standard should be, but I did see many, right, without searching for them, and this is the thing that disturbed me, meaning that they are out there and they do make they do reach people. Let's say lots of I can say historians, but people, generally speaking, involved in history. It can be everything. It can be historians, archaeologists, it can be even reenactors, emists, and so on. That, in my opinion, make kind of, let's say, do not render justice, let's say, to the seriousness of the disciplines, do not quite separate, let's say, what is the historical knowledge broadly meant, and the importance of it from, let's say, a kind of an exhibitionistic, almost narcissistic abuse of the same. That is to say, if you are a university professor who spends all his time on Instagram sharing stupid memes and check all the likes that you get, to hope to you gonna flirt with some of your likers, let's say, or you're an actor that has to go out there thinking that is special, because does that and it's superior to the average even though he's just, an underschooled ethno-nationalist, which cannot even pay for a decent education. And you are maybe just a history student who wants to show off, pretending that is cultured or intellectually developed because, they studied university by sharing things that fundamentally they don't even understand. They have just, copied, shared from other people they have seen. They propinated them. Well, my idea is that, your historical quality is basically non-existent. That is to say, if you have that time to waste for such things, chances are that you're really not doing much with your life in the first place, right? And this is the thing that I have, frankly, no fear to say out loud, right? Because the reason why I make these videos is primarily to make people aware of such things. And I know that what I'm saying does cause malaise, and that, there are people who cannot accept this, but it's exactly today's, our time's disease, right? It's, let's say, underperformance, under, even mediocre standards, as paraded as uniqueness or specialty, or anything provided of any kind of qualitative interest, and an endless shouting that is, look at me, right? Because fundamentally there is no other way you can accomplish but without such kind of crying. And it does reflect naturally also the appalling levels of if you, there are many parallelisms we could make to this. Now I made these examples that are very, relatable in a way, because I'm sure that any of you knows those types of people in a way, and I'm sure some, some of you, and we isn't, like, we all waste our time in a way, etc. But there are ways, and especially reasons to do that, right? And history, as actually, this is not even about history, but actually understanding history helps. I mean, but understanding somebody's motives, right, and mechanisms behind that it's not really difficult, right? I arrived at the point, I don't know, some practice, but some after 10 years or more on the internet, I guess that I began to spot patterns, right, in people's informations, in people's attitudes, words, behaviors, and I must say that if this was a kind of a psychological training, right? Never had a formal psychological education, but I must say that I can't even foresee what kind of answer I get from people I never even talked to, and in the moment I see fundamentally the personas that I have created and they put out there, and when I contact this, I say, damn, I hate to be right all the time. Of course, you also understand other things, and this is not to say that we should have a contempt towards anybody just because of such things. Of course, these things are antipathetic. They are objectively bad. Humans are not just that, but at the same time, that gives you a scale of a dimension of the horizons of that person. So even if they can't do something positive, it's not much about that, but it's about properly, in fact, the scale, right? The ability, the capacity to do more and in a more complex fashion, which is exactly what history should provide you with, right? At a greater level, because of all the issues, the problems, the nuisances that it presents you with, in order to make sense essentially of a system that cannot really be sorted out, and that completely, but that exactly for this reason exercises you, kind of teaches you how to do it in practice with no fixed base, right? This is the let's say the scientific education that history provides you, but sometimes even actually easily more than so-called hard sciences on average, right? That always, of course, depends on the relative system that we're talking about. So this naturally brings you to make generalizations like I do here now, but that we all approximate, right? Even in science. So, frankly, that's not a problem. The thing about that is being accurate, right? And therefore realizing whether there is any quality, in fact, to the scientific understanding of such field. In this case, of such topic like history. Now, the question again should be: why should we overestimate in which situations, in which circumstances, and underestimate at the same time somebody's historical, competence or expertise? This is something I think applies a bit to everybody. Like, I think as men we can understand the competition, the aggressiveness, the lust for power in a sense, and the craving for glory, all these things in clashes between males, right? Women do have something similar to, but it does travel on other tracks, and I will not venture in those ones. I don't qualify but for that. But let's say I've seen consistently that that people do use this to boost their own morale, their own self, right? I've seen all the time, right? Especially, the typical thing is when you're young, especially in your early 20s, like you still think more or less that what you study is what you're gonna be, and what qualifies you as an individual, right? Then eventually you grow up, and sadly, many people don't, right? Not just because they don't really take the studies as something more serious than just a sheet of paper at the end of them that allows them to get, a couple hundred euros more than in wage somewhere, right, for a job that has not even to do with that. But it's about properly the in fact the show, right, the faking, I don't know how to say this, but the acting, let's say, or the pretending that the title, that education, that actually has an intrinsic value per se, right? And there are very interesting ways to overestimate and underestimate people, but on the base of some almost stereotypical, let's say, patterns, right? As you know, I hinted at this. I've been interacting in my life really with lots, but I mean lots. You don't want to know how much. Foreign people, mostly Westerners, and I have such ideas that if I were to talk about, on YouTube about, I would probably be not banned, but I would receive so much, hatred and, I could even say I don't care about the thing itself, but when you're young, another typical thing is that you think that you can leave more, that it's a moral thing to leave the benefit of the doubt, right? So that you say, but it's not all true, right? You're an iconoclast, right? When you're young, when you're a kid, fundamentally you're framed within hierarchy, under hierarchy, right? You're, as it should be, under your parents, under your family, demand, the school, the state, whatever. You are given that that kind of of mold, right? And then eventually there is the iconoclastic thing, where as a teenager, as a young adult, you think you're the best, you have this enormous energy, you can do better, more than everybody, you start contesting everybody, and therefore also all the things you were told in form of stereotypes, why kids do contest authority, they're more they're crazier, more aggressive, because they're meant at that point to be in a phase in which they have to learn how to make things work on their own. So it's a normal cerebral process, about also not the consolidation of your prefrontal cortex up to 24, 25 years old. In fact, their things do change, and fundamentally you start saying, no, everything I was told is wrong, right? How true is this? We look at today's times, where even the essentials of history, of of common decency, even of biology, and but even everything of politology, of sociology, anything, for not talking about history, of course, is completely twisted. And because of course everything is designed on the base, unfortunately, not just of a anographic dimension of young people, but that of course are the consumers mostly through which the social media now are oriented, but even kind of to the adolescentialization of adults, right, in terms properly of educational standards and a kind of level of expertise, etc. So just little machines that can fit, whatever job, that the situation gives them. And so with no backbone, no resistance, and with an ideology that is of course oriented towards that kind of iconoclasm, right? Because if you leave people ignorant at that point and inexperienced, right, unskilled and untrained, it's easier, of course, to control. That they will never become adults, right? They'll always be in an adolescent stage up to, even if they are decrepitly old. And this, is not just today's times, but today's times are enforcing this, and it's a process of impoverishment and and also relative undereducation of the masses. It's a new feudalism fundamentally, and there's nothing strange about this historically speaking. It's no surprise, and it's also very easy to read. All right, in the global dynamics, there's no conspiracy. I mean, yeah, there are some kind of obvious interest behind this, but it's kind of normal. Like, again, it's something that has always kind of happened, and the world went up and down according to certain patterns. Anyway, right? We're just in that phase now. These things do happen. But what I was saying is that iconoclasm brings you to leave the benefit of the doubt, right? Such as that, every country is fundamentally, yeah, there are pros and cons, but we're all human, right? And that's what matters. Yeah, let's go together. There is also almost a sexual reason for that. You need to copulate with anybody you find, right? At the point of your age or things like that, or at least you need, but it's not that you should, by the way. But they're designed for that. These are all biological. People believe that they have some kind of, autonomy in that. I don't mean part, of course, there is. There is always the idealist perspective next to the materialist one, but still, they're blended. That they cannot be explained without the other. But again, looking at the world, I realized that this is absolutely not true. That the great part of my historical studies revolved at the end of the day around having an actual understanding of the world, right? That's another issue here, right? What's your driver, your curiosity, whatever. For most people, again, being a historian is trying to have that kind of categoratic vest to tell people, oh, look, I'm competent, I'm a cultivated person, I'm intellectually developed, and all this stuff. But the actual point there is mostly, if you look at the product of academia normally, along those patterns and those the dramatically attritional process that creates this professional figures, that is, again, as we've seen many times, essentially a lot of hyper specialization without any context. So these people that's the primary reason why I say that academic quality is sinking, because objectively without that there can't be even properly a scientific culture properly meant, right? If you don't have an idea of something that you want, you will hear maybe at some point at the first year of university, and then you will not even touch any book in your life about, because at the end you may become a PhD but just remaining focused on that think till you go to the grave without any kind of diversion. Right? That's something that even a machine could do. Frankly, machines will learn to do at some point. What machines cannot do is having the incredible synthesis capacity of human brain that produces an astonishingly qualitative amount of information, and that is exponentially fruitful. That is to say, the more you know, the more human brain is able to literally put in relation such thoughts and ideas in ways that is extremely precious, right? Is incredible. That's why, as I often say, we should invest dramatically in education since a very early age, because we must cultivate it. If we cultivate that, we will create an amount of people that are not just knowledgeable. That's what is mostly misunderstood about what we need to know, and people don't understand, in fact, because they don't know enough most of the times. It's the moral strength that derives from the motivation, properly in that sense, that derives from that acknowledgement, that is almost like I don't know, it seems like a cure for so many problems in this world, and it's like probably one of the single most precious goods of exchange. That is, there are the same ones that that made society, right, out of chaos, right, and making it standing, right, and that's why it's also so dangerous, again, to observe the patterns that are happening today, and that is almost not realized, right? We mostly say, that person knows a lot, and he seems like a very intelligent guy or girl, and because they have studied, and they're smart, but do you understand what that smartness is? Because the smartness in that sense, smartness is actually not even about intelligence proper, or intelligence is also a very complex thing in its own, but it's treated approximately like a mental condition, right? You're smart as if you were depressed, or not the same thing, but even though it does happen sometimes, even to connect this, but let's say you're, I don't know, extroverted, therefore that guy is smart, or you can overlap all these things, of course, and they're not comparable by themselves, but it ends there, right? Instead, intelligence is something that actually drives, right? In fact, the figure of the historian, of the cultured person, of the intellectual we have today, is not much the one of a leader, but kind of a abstract thinker, right? Or at least it's seen like that. It's seen, why all that knowledge if, at the end of the day, things are just too complicated to be sorted out, etc. It's not really about that, even just positive application, but or that understanding, that sorting out of reality. It's about the force that that an individual can cultivate by knowing reality. That's the driver. That's the thing that makes people understand which direction should take, and it's extremely complex, again, because we cannot understand really what human mind goes through in the process. But it is quite evident to anybody who has gone that path, has quite easily elevated, because it doesn't take much below the average, immediately understood that the motivation there is what has really made the difference in the process of learning, as suppose somebody has really not passed through the same thing. So it's exactly the framing, the narrowing down, the quasi-medicalization of the scientist condition that is reflected by the same individuals most of the times, because again, I think that the standards are appallingly low. That shows how unaware our own community, our own world is of such benefits, right? This stems from broader reasons, meaning that, of course, it's, this is not much about how to solve the problem, right? Because at that point you should have dramatic changes that paradoxically would stem exactly from that kind of mass motivation. But if the mass motivation is not, right, it's just going to be a very long struggle, or just some enlightened individuals that try to tell things to people, and most of the people do not really understand them, and those who do maybe make an improvement, and then eventually civilization gradually evolves. But we're also arrived, as we know, that the world is not something isolated, nor that simple by itself systemically. So lots of things happen in the meanwhile, great mechanisms and processes that we don't even have a clear grasp of yet, because it's unpredictable, right? And therefore, it's as if this pattern was perturbed constantly by major waves, shocks and aftershocks, and all the things that happen and revolve around us. And humans are very easy to impress in a way, and there is always a sort of idea of end of the world at the same time, as well as end of a history of illusion in a way that is that tells you how schizophrenic this attitude can be. But never underestimate that, in fact, the moral dimension in the world, in history, it's not about matter. It's not about inanimate objects, right? People have to relate to these things, and again, the way we don't focus on the way people do relate on these things psychology is still, as far as I understand, for the few I know, still rooted in an empirical method, right? Methodology, broadly speaking, and therefore it's relatively more immune from certain ideological extremes, maybe than other subjects. In a sense, this is I understand it's not really so, because let's say there are also very morally relativistic takes on such things, such as that human beings, at some point, you could easily say it's always the double threat. From one side, you could say it's just biology, genetics. Nobody goes in therapy anymore because they realize objectively that it doesn't work, right? Most people that go to therapy, first of all, are not depressed. They just can't handle problems that they know perfectly how they should handle most of the times, and they don't. So it's kind of their fault, right? Even if something very bad happens to them, but at the end of the day, they should have at least the moral resources to cope with that on their own, and the intelligence. And that's also why, again, history would be a great provider of morality in that sense, right? I'm not the first person who has has realized that, for example, learning history makes you dramatically closer to the acceptability of God than basically any other field. Again, it's actually a scientific consequence. It's not ideologism at all. It's completely the other way around. But it turns out, in fact, it's mostly either, you take antidepressants or other medicines for coping with certain specific pains, or most people, the only people actually antidepressants work with are those people who have actually a good life and that they wouldn't have any reason to be depressed. And in fact, it turns out if you give them antidepressives, they actually are cured immediately, or most miraculously, and most of the times, unfortunately not everybody, but still, right, to show you how we are actually the cause of our own problems most of the times, and that therefore whining about them is actually a form of cowardice, not to take matters in our own hands, even when objectively life is hard, right? Who would have told life is hard? Well, there is even here cultural problems. Even our generation was promised, like in a sense, we already knew it would be fucked up. In the broader world, maybe, and later generations will pay even more for that. But let's say the idea was almost the happy ending, right? The idea that everything will fix itself. Yeah, you will have the future technology. Everything will work for you. Yeah, it will be great. No, like you cannot really, treat human existence in those terms. It's an anti-educational, anti-scientific, and actually fundamentally moral idea, right? But that's what we keep saying to people, right? It's not really a way to encourage them. On the contrary, it shouldn't be making them see a catastrophe either. But it's crucial to make them understand if the things go well, it largely depends on them, and not just the individual, of course, but say starting from the only person anybody is responsible with, and the only one, that is yourself. And there are interesting ideas in this, and there are always the Marxist guard that at least the culturally Marxist guard that says that capitalism will fail because this thing had to slow down, and therefore we cannot work just with capital. Yeah, keep believing in that and see what will, especially you, and because most of the background that you come from, at least in those who follow this insanity and autoimmune disease, really belong to. They're going to be paradoxically, the elite will cause the misery of those who follow them in that regard, that specifically. But this is yet another topic, right? Conservatives are not really faring that better, let me tell you. But the question here is overestimating. You see, we were starting from the fact that there are countries you cannot really make moral relativism about. There are always those places that where after you have talked to literally thousands of people who come from that place, and they all say more or less the same thing in ways that you have never heard anywhere else, and you understand that are obviously connected to very evident historical reasons why they think their minds is shaped like that. It's not to say what their opinion or a certain topic is, right? That is already to say, by the way, watch out, because you can have two different opinions, and so therefore you automatically know that one, at least of them, is wrong, right? And you should point it out out of a moral principle, and that's why it's also hard to make people understand such things. And when you understand that this especially extends to large groups of peoples for whichever national, cultural, whatever reasons, let's say, that they come from their background, you can't even continue lying to yourself that everything is relative and everything is okay. Let's let it go the way it do. Live and let leave, as if everybody can do what they want. We're all special in our own way. This is actually not true, right? This is not the case. It's actually, it doesn't even reflect reality in the same political and social and military dimension that we know in historically. Right, we that is all what we know about mankind, essentially. So it can't be like that. There can't be an extremism. You can't say row towards one direction or another, but the extreme, we already know pretty well it doesn't work, and that's why this is also connected to the fact, of course, that we are programmed like dumb apes to fundamentally shut down our prefrontal cortex every time political decision is to be taken, because that's the extreme one where our ancestors were to take immediate decision after somebody was attacking or ambushing them, and therefore it was either blue pill or red pill, right? There wasn't any other greater sophistication, but most people do still reason like that. We all do, right? And in fact, it's dangerous whenever in politics, as in love, that when your brain shuts down, fundamentally, you're dangerous, right? And nature programmed us like this, but let's say the reason why it takes so much struggle in order to make things work is that, and from a civilizational point of view, is that the building, what we have built as a species to elevate ourselves from this miserable condition requires a constant and huge amount of work. So if the average kid horizon is to fundamentally bail out hard studying and hard working just to hope that by sharing Instagram pictures half naked will make them famous and somebody will pay for them in some way, well, that's, first of all, it's called prostitution. And another way is also, and you can accept it at least on a moral ground, must be oriented, and therefore individual freedom there doesn't quite exist because it's never existed. At best we had liberty, right? And this is exactly what you should do. Like it's essentially finding the best compromise to for those who have instead greater moral force to reshape the world on this pattern, right? It's easier sometimes to exploit these masses, but at the same time there is also not a very long-sighted principle in that sense, because frankly I don't want to live in a world where there are just a few people that command because they are elite, and yes, they are kind of endowed with a undeniable superiority, as in history has always been, but the rest of the masses therefore is just like an extension of them by some degree. I prefer to have a community where everybody's valuable for real, right? Not like today, and where there is, for this reason, a broader consensus about what should be done fundamentally, even in in a democracy with of course an indirect one with normally two for the reasons we're saying, essentially two, like a left or a right, two orientations at that point. Should dialogue and what it's one direction or another regarding a specific issue, and working together to make things work, right? And naturally this is the best scenario that cannot quite be maintained. We don't know how to maintain, right? At least I think it would be easy. It would have to pass through such realization, that this is what history made me realize more than anything else. I don't believe in the fact that while I do believe in original sin and that we're therefore faulty and rigged and so on, this I do believe also in the in reason, in morality, in this natural impulse that humanity has to fix problem. Because if that wasn't true, like, history of civilization wouldn't make sense, right? I take history as a huge proof that that is the case, that it's not, of course, a linear process, that there are, of course, external factors, that civilization also passes through a growth for which lots of mistakes are done along the way, but that's exactly what eventually teaches you the art way, what should be done, should not be done. And even though everything is a new challenge all the time, still, somebody who is, again, provided with the moral capacity, with the intelligence, the moral capacity to cope with the unforeseen is, of course, a better, it's more eligible to live on, right? Normally, this is what happens, right? Even historically, right? I would like to stress, in a way, that even the, not the necessity, because nothing is really necessary, but let's say, even certain controversial aspects, such as, more developed civilization taking over others, etc. I don't really see a problem in that, right? I don't really see a problem, for example, in a country that is taken over, if it doesn't have essentially the strength even to defend ourselves, right? And that is a natural process. It's not about the evil bully from next door that just want to take over. It's about that system weakness that depends on, again, somebody's fault, right? And that's why we need to martyrize the ideologically the defeated, right, from whichever side you mostly you side at some point, in fact, and that's also another pretty bad, and it's a very good indicator, for example, of absence of historical literacy and consequently of scientific and moral education for that point, for that matter. But let's say we cannot abstract ourselves from the world. This is the main call. We have to understand how things function for the direct connection that exists between the outcome and what the individuals have done, because nothing can do with individuals. We can really think of history for abstract community, abstract states, flags, colors on a map, and thinking that's it, right? It's never been like that. It's always been this masses of people that are doing extremely difficult things to understand at a first look, but then if you start understanding the inner mechanisms, you can also try to make sense. And this is what fundamentally what history teaches you, right? That's why at the beginning, again, you're ignorant and you don't know things, and that's why you learn and you grow up, and you do because you passed through an acquisition, a knowledge that is not just like a notion, an anecdote, but it's something that you have tested to essentially work, to have worked in history. Of course, again, there's a lot of ideologism. At the same time, we talked very often about method, how to study history and all these things, but fundamentally, even in here, reality doesn't seem to be alterable for a long time, even when we see ideologies stemming from, again, mental diseases such as communism, socialism, nationalism, and all these things, fascism. You understand that these things belongs, first of all, to the morally diseased places. Like, it's not that you can see it Russia in the 1910s or Germany in the 1930s as some morally healthy places, right, from any standard. So you have to understand that, of course, these things happen because there is a problem. But secondly, even there, right, you cannot completely fake the thing. You cannot fool people. You cannot essentially exercise a complete individual single thought, right, for which people follow blindly. This factually never happened, right? You can do something much worse than that, though. In, let's say, something horrid that is, for example, teaching exactly in these situations to deny reality. In a sense, this is a prerogative, essentially. What any socialist reality is basically has left enormous damage to the people that have lived within it, and the paranoia and substantiating in the denial of reality, and especially the denial of historical reality, and the denial of the fact that history is positively frameable, is possibly the first thing ever that is distinctive of that outcome, and of course corresponds to the fact that history is not taught. It was not taught there for what it was. So of course, if you isolate people from knowledge, that can be the result. Today is very difficult, fortunately, right? You could do that in the first half of the 20th century when the masses needed still to be schooled effectively and all this stuff. But today, fortunately, our education at least makes that, but it's not just education, it's the consequences of the superiority of civilization that has brought the means and the capacities, the communication, the wealth, etc., that allows us to communicate, to share thinking. And so you cannot quite trick people for a long time, right? You can obscure the internet, like in China, like in North Korea. You can at least certain sites, etc. But and people tend to be conservative in that sense. There is a lot of cognitive dissonance relatively to even, of course, I don't know. We had a Chinese student once in our faculty, in our department. And I remember, like, my tutor had to explain her literally what religion is. Right, if you're born and raised in China, you objectively don't know what that is, and that tells you the abomination in the dignity of mankind that such things can bring to. Right, but of course, that is something that person, for example, was exposed to because, again, she came to a free world to learn, and that's something that eventually her government cannot even obstacle her from. But it's something that, that's because she's Chinese and then so on. But, look at the Uyghur Turks and within insane China, what is happening right now. The news that had come out a few days ago about the literal, deportation, cultural genocide, and things that we already knew from years that nobody obviously gives a shit about, right? Except, being a non-binary pansexual kangaroo. But for the rest, all these things do not exist. This is a new form of alienation, of moral inferiority, of cheapification. I don't know if it's cheapening, we could say, of the masses, like properly from a human quality. That is to say, humans have quality, of course, intrinsically, right? But they have potential, right? Then it's all about what they do, and if they don't do anything, of course, that's a lower quality, right? And this does have a cost, right, for other people, right? And this is a huge problem. And we cannot cope with that easily, just by caresses and pats on the shoulders. So, what impressed me, of course, in the broader, my broader supervision of world affairs, is that, of course, you can legitimately, and you should be prejudiced. Right, prejudice is not a bad thing. It just reveals the fact that you are a knowledgeable person, and that, of course, that different groups are different because it's simply, a physical reality. It doesn't even have to do with human beings, right? It has to do with any kind of system that you study. But it's properly about the realization that the world must be interpreted through such standards, right? It's like history. Where do you want to start from? Like history, it's funny when you say, people say, you should say only what it's scientifically, rigorously, right? Cause-effect connection. If we had stopped to that, we would have basically extinguished in the generation. This would have happened all over the world, because we would have simply being mentally paralyzed to be incapable of doing anything without, as we do, basically not knowing most of what we are actually doing. You do think that if you get up to fill a glass of water because you're thirsty, you're actually thinking of what is happening there scientifically. You just do it. Yes, something scientific is happening. You do have the thing kind of ingrained within yourself. But if you were to explain that, do you explain existence? Can you explain your own consciousness? Can you explain how this interacts with other people? You would say, then how do we know anything? How do we know history? How do we know science? Well, we still do, right? Because we see that in reality that works, and that's fundamentally what we're all about as an individual, existentially speaking. And that's why it is important to be exposed to reality and not to wishful thinking. This is yet another thing that shows you how, of course, we're naturally brought to overestimate and underestimate people as a consequence, right? We do it sometimes, for most of the times actually, for irrational motives. But these irrational motives are not necessarily wrong. And I'm a person who thinks, for example, that first impressions do matter, right? I think that it's actually easy to understand somebody's person, again, especially through historical tastes, and again, but not just the way they present themselves, just the way that they want to, they pretend themselves to be. You see, people before minded their own business. They had all their own job. They didn't think about much showing off, again, on social media, or presenting their own self to the world, right? They just live their own life. Today, it's about, again, showing people, what you pretend to be, and in the same moment in which you proceed with that, you're essentially exposing what in theory, some of your best should be about, and in the mechanism through which you think, and sometimes, as always, the superficiality through which you do it, and the things you put out there, of course, define you as easily as a more or less developed person, as somebody who, even not showing something means something, and maybe not even a bad thing. Actually, as we understand here, very often people who do not put a lot out there about their own selves are actually maybe the most serious ones, are the ones that go straight to the problem. Sometimes it's not like that, of course, but on average, this is by experience what I got to. So when, let's say, with historical knowledge, overestimating somebody is important preemptively, right? It's about being cautious of the fact that exactly from such realization, you cannot understand everything at a first sight, and that therefore you will immediately have an idea, and that's the idea that most of the times will trick you, right? Because it's not much of the fact that it's going to be wrong. It's just that it has to be contextualized, it has to be integrated, it has to be essentially developed further, right, from the base that you have. And therefore, if you want to be, if you have high standards and you want to behave in kind of a rigorous way, in a kind of intelligent, reasonable, polite, consistent way, you have to leave that benefit of the doubt, even if in your mind you're prejudiced, right? If you have this bias, that again, it's perfectly normal. There is nothing wrong about that. It's perfectly fine. It works with every single human group, right? And it turns out that every human group, whichever it is, on average, it sucks, right? Wherever you come from, or whatever your orientation is, or whatever your tastes are, whatever. If you pick the average, right, most average kind of sucks by what we could easily obtain just by sticking to the standards that actually the same community has already set. That is to say, banally, if you, I don't know, it's the thing that they always said, that I was very impressed to read the programs of my high school programs, right? Because if we had actually learned everything it was there, we would have been already, all geniuses, right? And so that was the standard that the ministry thought to be, issued nationally, and then we should stick to that. It was a hell of a good one. It could have even been achieved if, especially the thing was carefully carried out during the years with rigor, etc. Instead, it's not. We fall out of that expectation, and therefore, as such, right, even if the average is important, still, it's not satisfactory. Shouldn't be satisfactory. That is to say, why the world should be the way it does. If you deny such standards, basically deny any kind of development, any kind of evolution, any kind of advancement, any kind of improving or bettering. And so it really the idea of not criticizing or not being judgmental, not to be biased, not to be prejudiced, is silly, right? It doesn't serve any civilizational purpose. It has literally nothing to do with. Of course, this one thing is taking an ideological stand. It's just, okay, this bias, as I described it here, was, as I told you very clearly, about what you have in your mind while you're actually behaving in a way that is fully as neutral as you can, because that's how humans should cultivate that capacity. You know that deep inside that you are kind of an animal that, doesn't actually have much of a self-control and all these things, and you just want to eat chips sitting on the couch. But you're also a human being, right? So you have certain mental capacities that most of the times make you desire that, but do not make you do that, right? And so that's how you behave with people at the same time. So a reason why you wanna temporarily overestimate your interlocutor on average is the same reason for which you're not going to be an asshole with your family, just to be, or with your spouse or with your friends, right? And this is kind of obvious, right? We are all imperfect, and for this reason, we should be compassionate and forgiving each other, which, believe me, is not easy, right? It's not easy nor to do nor to get. And so it's part of the reason why also much of our suffering stems from most of the time. But it's also normal, right? For example, I'm a capitalist, but as far as family is concerned, of course I'm a socialist, right? If I wouldn't, I would obviously help without any interest my family. But there are some psychological things that say that it's always about the reward at the end of the day. Yes, it is true, but in the sense, because that reward, if that reward is love, trust, and respect, yeah, why wouldn't I want that? That's a positive thing. That's a beautiful thing. And so it should be. With history, like you wanna be careful with, of course, people you talk to, because you may be talking to anybody. And since I talk about history, because this could be any topic actually, but because this channel talks about history, so the question is, of course, history is also about testing each other's knowledge at some point. I must say, most of the times I meet people back in the day, maybe it's because now I talk with kind of older people, more like my age. When I was younger, I said, I study history, or at the time, or like history and so on. I didn't get much of a response, because generally the people I talked to didn't know much about that in the first place. And then, the more you get older, and the more you find somebody that says, oh, wow, that's actually kind of cool, right? And I like, even if maybe I don't know that, I meet of all these kind of things. So at that point, I don't even need to I understand. I admit I'm kind of disappointed, because I would like to find somebody that likes history like I do, even if in different ways. I admit that I do have problems, that there is some egoistic component in the fact that I have I need to feel in a sense superior to, like, I would have difficulties, for example, to have, like, for example, with my exes. My last ex was a historian, actually, and she knew actually a lot of things that I didn't, right? But overall, I still thought, like, I still understood that. I mean, she wasn't actually even a full properly historian, because she studied also other things. But in that sense, I liked her, because we could talk about things that were of our respective fields that were kind of interesting. Like, she was a musicologist, and she studied also languages. So those are things that I like, right? Because I like music, but of course I didn't know that as well as her. She knew languages that I don't know, and I knew. No, actually, she knew all languages that I know myself. At some levels, actually, I knew the ones I did better than her. Some not. But let's say, you see, that there was her sphere, there was my sphere. And my sphere, as a historian, as a military historian, I told the thing, and she was somebody I could talk to, right, about those things, and kind of making her interested, but not feeling challenged about being, essentially the one that was stopped in that sense. And I had problems with, for example, my previous ex. Instead, she didn't know much about history. Like, she kind of liked it, but she didn't right? She wasn't like a history person. And I had problems with somebody else at some point, because I realized that instead this other person thought that the things I knew were kind of maybe like that she wouldn't be enough for the things I knew, and that's something that hurt me deeply, because instead she loved history at the same time. It's just, she even there she knew something else, but she wasn't properly a historian. She didn't study that. So I felt bad about that, because she was also a person that wouldn't open too much. So I never fully understood even in there how, like, I grasped from all my hints, from my vision that cannot, from which nothing can escape. That of course, on certain things she was limited, on certain things she wasn't actually. But I perceived that it was a problem. For example, for her, that I knew history apparently better, also because of the obvious, formal situation that existed there between us. And so at that point, I realized how difficult it can be to, as it happens, when you meet somebody that uses his or her own knowledge to make you feel kind of subordinate in a sense, or less. I believe that men, I'm a sexist, I have no problem with that. I think that men should rule in a relationship. I think that's how eventually a family is supposed to work. And even if, maybe there are men who are less, let's say impositive, or to have it doesn't matter. Like, there should be a hierarchy that, in my opinion, in the in patriarchal character has a value of civilization. It is not to say that the women are degraded in that sense. It's a matter of command, right? And the command should be about the man, and the woman simply is best at other things, right? And that's what make her a woman. So you perfectly understand where I come from here, because I have no tolerance whatsoever for what is going on right now about certain ideologies that I think, fortunately, most people are completely not buying. And I do have a great respect for people's knowledge as well, and that's why I don't like when somebody is trying to enforce a vision that stems not from in fact, a scientific understanding, but just from a sense of weakness, a sense of insecurity, right? So it's important for me to test somebody else's knowledge, because at that point it's a mechanism in which the same interrelational interaction is based, and thus it cannot really be ignored that simply. And there are ways, humans are different. There are so many different combinations and ways to get along. It shouldn't really be a problem either, right? It's not something so dramatic as it sounds. I don't know. Of course, I think I could hardly be with anybody who thinks that the Holocaust was a positive thing, for that matter. But for the rest, I'm kind of easygoing, and I accept other people's points of view. It's just maybe I have this fault that I always dig into, like, why that person has that kind of idea, and that's where I think it gets interesting and controversial, but still functional to a broader improvement. That is to say, there are different qualities of thought, right? There are different levels. It's a vertical thing. There's a different scale in certain acquisitions. So that's the same reason why I stress so much the importance of civilization. For example, there is in this mechanism an anti-civilizational bias, which is sadly enough and also ingrained in a lot of conservatism, right? When you look at tribalism or ethno-nationalism, you realize there that the reason why those people believe that is fundamentally they have a smaller and a narrower minded view of an understanding of the world, because they cannot fundamentally understand in what their civilization has been objectively superior, and instead they revert back to tribalism, to nativism, to primitivism. That is essentially nothing else than what also the left is doing, because sadly enough, most conservatism and alt-rightism is actually about National Socialism, which is still socialism, contrarily wise to what people what make you think because they think they discovered they're good because they know the differences between fascism, socialism, and National Socialism. Actually, they all stem from the same socialist matrix. Yes, they are different, but the premises fundamentally are the same. Right? So you can't really fool around like that. If you believe in those ideologies, you're an intellectually inferior person, and consequently also a morally and scientifically one. And there is no way around that, right? One has to be, brutally clear about this, that the superiority and the strength and the power do not derive from that, right? As if history, by the way, hadn't shown for all the Nazis and communists that we have massacred. And so that is an important aspect of the, I would say, of a decent human being, right? Just knowing history for what it actually is, not what, your level of ignorance makes you feel better about. And of course, this applies actually to everybody. Because one good reason for being, not to underestimate, and therefore, in fact, to overestimate somebody's knowledge by default, is that ignorance is the standard mode of humanity, right? First of all, you learn. Like you are you don't know things. You're not born taught, as we say. In our country, the idea is that you learn. You learn because you don't know, because you're an ignorant, because you have to get that information, right? The problem, of course, is not much just people say it's not about ignorant people really, but about what you learn. That is to say, it would be better to just not to know certain ideologies and being just an ignorant. It would, well, in practically speaking, yes, in theory, but I disagree in a theoretical sense, meaning that, and not in an abstract one, by the way, because you can measure that. That is to say, it's at that point when you learn something more complex, right? Though there are greater chances that you're able to understand better complexity, and therefore reality in its entirety, and therefore to be dislodged from certain ideas, right? Of course, if at that point your goal is not learning more, but just being in a community of people who flatter each other because of their ideology, you're weak again, because the only person you should rely on is yourself, right? You cannot be saved, but through through humanity proper. Right, and that there are of course, religious implications to that, but because you do learn from humanity in that regard, and it does happen at different levels, but this doesn't mean that if humanity flatters you are deresponsibilized by your own, your act. It's the same thing with the totalitarian thing. They make the people believe that they are martyrs, that they have to make the last effort, that the world is against them, that they are surrounded, that they're besieged because they want to cancel their right to exist, and all this bullshit. Because of course, it's not that they will actually believe that. The objective of that is to fueling hatred towards the external, so that they can feel more competent about themselves. That's why there is no moral dignity to have belonged to a authoritarian or dictatorial, totalitarian reality, because of course you are, in the moment in which you didn't refuse that, but you let it happen, you sold yourself to essentially mafia, and that's basically it, right? And there is no other way to really cope with the thing, if not, in fact, becoming paranoid and denying reality at that point, until you discover on which mass of graves and blood you stand on at that point. So a good reason not to always underestimate somebody's potential is to give another chance, is to be in a sense compassionate, is pretending that until you don't have a factual proof, it's a scientific principle, right? Until you don't have evidence, you can't quite say something for sure. You can have your bias, but you essentially keep at that point for yourself. But you should always, in this sense, also research for that kind of attitude, because sometimes what happens is that we leave too much benefit for the doubt, right? This can't go on forever. You can't just say, okay, you meet somebody who says that, I don't know, he's a communist or a fascist. Well, at that point, you see, there's no way to compromise with that, because it's not important. Maybe those people are not even communists or fascists, but maybe there's something else, right? They're cultural something or neo something, which may not necessarily be better, but they're still not quite the thing. But the same thing that they present themselves as communists and fascists, it's something that should wake you up to fundamentally become radically and totally and intolerant to any kind of that bullshit, because it has no place in the dignity of human morality, right? It doesn't exist any space for such visions in a civilized world, and this is it's over, right? There is no but, there is no perspective, it's all moral relativism. It's like people who complain about the United States because they bombed Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They don't understand the thing, right? They're too dumb. They haven't studied the history, they haven't studied the strategy, they haven't studied the politics, so they feel themselves, from their intellectual mediocrity, to be entitled to have to claim for some kind of appreciation from the surroundings, that just because they feel less about themselves. And that's so easy to get. It's so easy to profile, psychologically speaking. But again, it is important, whenever you see the chance for somebody being able to be a better person, to have, of course, a dialogue. Of course, it's not that, there are different ways you for example, you have to behave, you can be and you should behave with people privately and publicly, I believe, meaning that even the communist fascist thing we said before is true, for example, mostly in a public sense. That is to say, publicly I would never respond to a communist or fascist. Like, properly, I deny talk to these people. In reality, I did admit myself, self-proclaimed, at least communists and fascists, that I even, I knew them for other reasons. Either were, that I knew them from school, like, and you can understand at that point what can that mean, in the brain of a kid, and we would talk about such things. We would comment on these facts and so on, and at a certain point, you kind of even like the person, because we just feel human sympathy, and at that point you should try to fix the problem. You should try to explain how things really are. And I must say that there are some beautiful memories I actually had in that past, and also a more recent one. But I managed to make somebody change their mind, which is not like a goal in the sense that I feel pride from changing somebody's mind per se. It's just that I feel like a goal to have come to some point that I know can be useful to people, and having provided them with that information, that whatever they do with that, it's on them, right? If they change their mind, I'm glad, because it's their own change, it's not my change, right? Because that's how much I respect the dignity of human intelligence, and that's therefore why I equally cannot tolerate any kind of insult to the same, right? Especially when at some point it's to show things that are not true, even to me, right? Because this is also about convincing, right? I don't know if for example, I've been tried to be convinced by people who were telling me about things that they didn't even know, and that I did. There were problems now. They're kind of stupid, as even crazy things that happened to me, but in a sense that they were very annoying, but they were also pretty simple and kind of. And I found it strange that somebody could reason like that, because if you know that the only person that knows this thing is me, and you don't, why are you trying to convince me about something that I know it's factually not so, because I'm the only person who was there, or at least who experienced certain things, and then but there was some senility involved, I would say. So, but it was it was still evil, because it was against the truth. It was something that I could hear or see, and one thing is being stupid because maybe you lack context and you still insist that something is in a way until somebody shows you that it wasn't kind of like that. That's also what history is like. It's a bit Sherlock Holmes, puzzles that where eventually kind of elementary in a way. But in fact, we should also stay sharp mentally to realize, and history is excellent for that, to realize all the possible options and implications. And that's why I believe this is so important, even for knowing people, because such visions really test somebody's intelligence, really test the boundaries of that, the limits, right? And also, surprise you sometimes to see how resourceful or capable people can be, even without a certain specific ability, right? To be good at other things you're not. It's perfectly normal. But again, given the leading role that I think history has in improving our community as such, right? And also the individuals, right? I believe still that scoping somebody's historical understanding is more important than many other things, or at least can reveal you a lot about lots of things about the person that are useful to understand ultimately what that person is, and that you may be rightfully interested in for that matter. So leave that benefit of the doubt until it doesn't conflict with some basic moral standards. That is, again, I'm not interested to have a dialogue with somebody that I already know is kind of not predisposed to change opinion by default. And it's almost paradoxical that this is the case for those people who mostly already have a developed ideology that is so ahead for other much narrower ideologies that are obviously dysfunctional in that regard, that if that is the level of the conversation, you can't waste the time to teach the basics, everything from scratch, right? Arriving to levels that sometimes take decades to reach, right? So that's why sometimes it's also good to refuse dialogue, to reject dialogue. And that's why before I was saying it publicly, this is very important, because if you publicly shut down somebody who has literally something that you don't care about, I understand it. It's not always. It shouldn't be the standard mode, right? Even for those who know that are not willing to change. Because why though? Because you still don't know the person, so you should give again the benefit of the doubt. When you see that the conversation is not leading anywhere because that the doubt is not a doubt anymore, you should quit it. And it's very powerful to do that publicly because you set an example there. And that's where you show your moral force and your authority and your authoritativeness, and therefore what the others can draw and what the others should follow in that regard. We do need leaders in this regard. Whereas if you have a private interest, a personal interest, of course, you're going to maybe having a dialogue with this person, going to dinner with this person, try to, if you have a specific goal, right, that you say, let's think this through, let's have a talk, let's take it easy, let's go by step and see what we can do about that. So in this process, as you understand, there's also always a sort of authority recognition, right? There is always a person who is kind of, leading the thing and the other following, right? Whereas, and this is very important as a struggle properly, there is properly a concept of initiative, of offensive, etc. So of course, if good ideas work as they do, your good ideas work, but you should also be able to express them correctly, which is not easy. It's just yet another thing, communication. That must be developed properly. How the medium you use to deliver the same concepts is very important. You can't be blasted by somebody, even if you know how to change that, right? That's also a matter of you know how to debunk that but maybe at the moment you still have to think the thing through, because you already kind of know that it's the case, but you still want to find an adequate response and how to think it to approach. And it's also about convincing a lot, indeed. But again, if you know your deal, you shouldn't actually have that kind of problem. And that's why, as I was saying before, even, it's not much about the good or bad intention, but it's actually about the moral force that stands behind somebody's conviction, right? And on average, this tends to level among human beings. That is to say that the people with greater moral force are the ones that actually get the thing right. So that even if they do something negative in the process, but still they're carrying a higher principle that others may not see. So it's obvious that it talking about this thing of overestimating, underestimating, there's always the fact of how sure, more than else, are you that what you know is actually the right thing. We always have that fear. We all have this fear that we can be owned in a way, right? And then we maybe are, but then we think about it and we say, wait a second, but this thing is actually can be sorted out this way, and something that I already knew, and after all I just had to integrate that other perspective in my system, making it stronger over time and knowing how to respond to that thing on another occasion. Now this is logically working all the time by itself. Like, it's how we learn and how we progress along the way. And that's why also dialogue with others is very important. And we're kind of losing that capacity too. I must confess myself, I do have difficulties to do it. I try to expose myself because I do interact with people most of the times, not really the ones that I share, let's say, my field of expertise with, and therefore although I read a lot and expose myself to other knowledge, like I realized that I would need that exercise specifically, because it's not like with history in general, it's not much about thinking to know history, it's actually working on it, which is a different thing. Like, it's a bit the difference between reading and actually, for example, making a research and having to write something down that will be checked by somebody else. It's a completely different thing. In a way, before you're just losing time. The other way, you're just instead improving. And the way you improve is much greater, much faster in relative terms than you imagine. But we're kind of lazy to make that qualitative effort. And that's why, at the end of the day, also we lag that behind most of the times. Why we lack properly that motivation and capacity and strength, because it derives from, okay, we'll think about that later, but then really not. I can tell you that even Schwerpunkt itself, and the fact that I had to talk so much just in front of you and having to cope with certain, I've never been criticized substantially in most things I say. That I never find somebody who says, man, you got it all wrong, it's all like this and that. I never had that kind of comment. And it's kind of weird in a sense, because I would have expected at the beginning to be dramatically targeted on the internet for things I say, just because I talked about history in the first place, right? Independently from any other kind of interest, let's say, but or vision or whatever. You understand what I mean, right? Not even talking about von Clausewitz is that easy in this world anymore. It's disconcerting sometimes. But in any case, this is about overestimating. And overestimating, again, always think this, that no matter how much you know, there is always something that other people know that you don't, right? And in reality, it's so complex that this is true virtually for every single topic. That is to say, history is so huge, for example, that any single person in the world knows something about history that you don't. Guess why? Because we're all different persons. That even our stories, of course, are a different story, and that we don't know the whole thing, right? But even if we're talking about an abstract historical anecdote about the past and distant past and so on, yeah, every person, even the most ignorant person in a place that never went to school, that never, that lives in the most abject moral material misery, they know something that you don't. So this should humble you all the time, and of course should make you adjust to the obvious realization that there is always a limit of intolerance. There is always a limit for the benefit of the doubt. There is always a limit for which you could say yes, which you can be wrong, right? There is always a moment in which you say, okay, I leave the benefit for the doubt, but up to this point, because otherwise it would surrender too much of what I have learned for a practical understanding, as far, in a way that I know I have worked to achieve as a concept, right? So this is really important. The maintaining the fact that there is no. Sometimes I get these questions: how do you actually get to a good, properly I would say rigorous. Mostly was about the process of learning, but as if you could get anywhere that has a fixed standard that is acceptable. That is not really fixable. That's the thing. That depends on your standards, depends on your goals, on your objectives. And by the way, history, just for talking about it, so huge that you can't quite even set a standard in a way, right? There are standards, but still they must be surpassed, and it costs more. It's more difficult, but again, if you can make it, my compliments, congratulations. I mean, that's where you have to arrive to be somebody that says something new and that brings forward, our understanding of the world. So, no doubt. Equally, underestimation is necessary in this sense. That is, when is it that you actually need to underestimate? What's the purpose of that? Well, as you just said, it's the reverse, right? It's when properly you must maintain those standards, and that you think that the other. You see, here there is something else, right? That often gets in the way, right? Leaving the benefit for the doubt, overestimating. It's not much the doubt on how much this person knows, but on the malevolence that this person has, right? To twist that narrative, to distort those facts, to interpret for a purpose that is not scientific. And that is also what all our knowledge is soaked in, right? Original sin is one of the most radically spot-on scientific understanding of human nature, right? We are always faulty. There is never a moment in our existence where we can attribute anything that happens to us completely to something random, to something external, to somebody else, right? It's not much about the fact that we are the ones that have to cope with the reaction. So, one or another, we have to learn the hard way that such things happen, and that we have to be tough and we have to have a backbone. Otherwise, we can't live in the world. But it's probably about the fact that most of these things happen by a certain margin because we are the ones who, in a sense, exposed ourselves to the risk of, at least, and sometimes literally went for. We know that. We do it all the time, right? We cannot take any action without risk. And therefore, let's say, underestimating somebody is somewhat necessary for healthy development, because if you think that you have even just no space in the world and that somebody else is, there is no way that you can do yourself, you wouldn't even learn further through your own mistakes, right? So underestimating is about realizing at that point that somebody is saying something that at least doesn't make sense with what you have learned, and that you can perfectly spot there that there is always some kind of malice in everything we say, right? In everything we say, there is some form of malice, right? Every time we say "but," we get a versative. We are actually we are injecting some negativity to it, that could be fixed differently. And if there weren't buts, we wouldn't be able to cut out certain things either, though. So in the broader economy of morality and action, you must suffer this. You must expose yourself to the risk of even, being targeted, right, by even for not being perfectly coherent, etc. But still bringing forward sometimes a point that for us is more important, right? It's like with critiques. We all know it's difficult to accept criticism in a way. On the other hand, we actually like that when the person who criticizes us does it in a way that actually doesn't make us take it personally more than much, or even if he does, it makes it in a way that is fair, that is correct, that is scientific, that has a some evidence, and that therefore says you're wrong, but not because you just like it's normal in a sense to be wrong on certain things for different reasons. But if you're provided with the information that tells you why this is the case, and the demonstration of it, and a cogent argument that makes you think that that's objectively true, and makes you realize something you didn't know before, that's a beautiful experience. That's how we are taught things, right? And there is nothing wrong. There is the moment of the disappointment. There is a moment of saying, "Damn, I could have done better." Yes, but at that point that's exactly that feeling that will make you remember that and not to be wrong next time. But if you see that somebody is maybe even giving you a correct information, but it's essentially doing it in a way that adds to, for example, something that, for example, is not, the main problem can happen that person doesn't understand what you're saying most of the times. That's also kind of a revelation that may not actually understand what you're talking about, but in fact the way they respond makes you understand that they are kind of dismissive themselves because they fear what you say, what you represent, and what you're there for. And that's also, and when the dismissive way gets kind of bitter and unnecessarily emotional, so you understand that something is going on, and that person is weak actually, and that you are, independently from whether you're right or wrong, that attitude reveals actually a weak spot the person has. So in that sense, you're justified to say, that at that level, if that's the tool and that's the attitude that person is habituated to cope with, that's not really the right way. Right, one thing is ridiculizing an idea just because it's that stupid. It's when you understand, in fact, from your perspective, the reason why another idea is truly stupid, like in criminal and dangerous and somewhat insane, right? And then you can dismiss it and even make sarcasm about that. And believe me, in order to use sarcasm, one must have a great intelligence, because otherwise it backfires. And most people believe that sarcasm is just, for them it just means being passive aggressive by the foe, and because they get pissed off if somebody says that just they are impolite and kind of sociopathic individuals, and so to say, they don't understand sarcasm. No, it's because you fundamentally don't understand how to use that. Those are the best people to use sarcasm against. But and I'm not a great fan of sarcasm by itself at all, but it's necessary to use that too sometimes. The question is, though, again, how much malice enters that idea, and malice may be sometimes even unintentional, right? Think about all those historical ideologies that actually are bent to some kind of paranoia. In fact, most of, as we were saying before, it can be anti-imperialism or national, ethno-nationalism, all these things that are by itself mostly anything that they're soaked normally, at least more than other isms, into a resentment that has no rational motivation, right? You let's say I presume that a developed person understands that feelings and reason, right, are two different things, right? It's not that, our reason is motivated by feelings, and what we think, we presume, is kind of, the point. But feelings crush against facts if reason fundamentally is not able to sort facts out correctly, so that most of our feelings are actually unmotivated, scientifically speaking. So being paranoid about your own country, for example, how many times, you see, do you, as I was saying before, on Schwerpunkt, I receive a very few criticism, right? Most comments are fundamentally saying, yeah, great work, this, maybe I can't hear well this audio or this thing, but the only negative ones are very patterned along the internationalist thing. This is to say, people arrive that have nicknames and avatars and the well appearance of somebody that is unequivocally and openly from one country, so they want you to know that they are, that get triggered because something that they don't understand in a single phrase in an hour-long video sounds threatening to the pre-constructed idea that they have about the holiness and beauty and purity and impossibly unchallengeable nature of their greatness of their country, right? And I won't make names here about specific countries themselves, but I think for anybody who toured YouTube on historical, it's always the same thing, right? This is actually a greater problem than it seems, because it comes from a bit every country. Like, we all pass through it. That's fundamentally the tribalist, primitivistic, internationalist stage that, way or another we'll get through, right, in life, and that some people just are not capable of surpassing, because again, they remain stuck to that level of understanding of reality that fits that. They don't get past the thing, and therefore they get phobic. They present the situation always as if, you don't understand the perspective because you're not from that country. That's the first bullshit of all, because of course being from one country has virtually nothing to do with anything in terms of historical understanding of that country. And if the point is that, it's usually because there can't be any, because of course if you are fixated about that, it's because you have no idea also of other countries' history, therefore you can't even give a realistic dimension to your own. And of course this takes some time, some effort, and some work, which most people don't make at all. So one thing is knowing stories, mythologies about your country. One thing is making history, which is a completely different thing that most people don't do. So until you don't do that, basically know nothing valuable about your country. It's just talk about what you heard from your family, about cliches, about resentment, paranoia, anger, matured against this or that other, stereotype that you have in mind. It has no scientific value. Nobody cares where you come from. This is very important. Like, Schwerpunkt doesn't give a fuck about where you come from. Like, nobody is special because it comes from a country or another, right? Literally nobody, right? The only thing that makes a person special is how intelligent and capable that person is, and that's it, right? And this can come, of course, from the fact that you come from one place or another, because again, we're not moral relativists. We recognize that somewhere things work better because, of course, things are better. But the fact of being born in one country, being raised in one country, has no value. You're not defined by that, right? If not in the form of declaring your own intellectual, moral inferiority and nothing else. Right, the fact that you cannot even distinguish such simple ideas from what the world is, that's pretty sad, right? And most people haven't the palest idea of what their country is, nor historically, nor culturally, nor politically, nor socially. Most people, right? Which means literally, it's a good 90-95%, right? So chances are that you don't, unless you have a specific education in that. In that informal one and scientific one, or at least a great knowledge that, again, doesn't mean that you're able to frame it correct for that matter. So you meet these people all the time. It's dangerous. It's a problem. Many people substitute their country with their religion, with their skin color, That's the new thing. Look at what is happening in the United States, where apparently the only thing that matters is the color of skin. Of course, most Americans do not buy the bullshit, but of course, in a disadapted, given the large masses of dispossessed and marginated and morally, materially miserable people that in that system do exist for reasons that are sadly real, right, politically, both for Republican and Democratic fault alike, it's obvious that such ideology gains ground, because as we were saying at the beginning, if you are worthless, of course you need to make worthless the rest of the world to feel good about it, right? And unfortunately, other people are not worthless, and that's going to be a problem for you. So either you start working hard, or you actually deserve to be confined in the condition of inferiority where you have relegated yourself in. Again, this is literally about superiority and inferiority, right? These are things that make the difference in politics, that make the difference in the world, that make difference in war, that make difference in civilizational development, right? And so this is really not a matter of personal opinion, because the truth is out there. You have the tools to investigate reality. Use them. If you don't, you remain stuck, right? You don't go in a journey that, if you age, you magically become intelligent. No. Most of chances are that you're going to lag behind at a point that you can't even fix the thing anymore, because also your brain is shaped, is built in a way that it takes certain specific ages to learn things well as fundamentals, and then eventually it becomes ever more difficult, and at a point most people don't even care, right? It's never too late to learn, but there are ways and ways and backgrounds that do influence the way this happens very much. So again, we should help people who have difficulties, but only in those situations that are acceptable, in fact, from a moral point of view, not imposing people, like dampening society because there are people who just do not they fall short of the standards, so we should lower all the grades, because what's the point of that? That's basically making people even dumber and creating an endless spiral problem. Just flattens the thing. Of course, the community at some point will rebel, and so it's impossible to push that too far, but still it's the empowering ideology that stands behind that tells people that they are incapable of any change because they are just born in a way or in another. Something so trivial like a skin color, right? So besides being a racist ideology, it's just even and being therefore a stupid one. But by itself, it's properly showing itself all its weakness. So it's very easy to tear down, and we're going to tear it down, right? And so conservatives do grow some spine, right? Don't pretend that you are special if you also reject education yourself, because you think that humanistic topics are not important, right? It's not because in your country you let Marxists taking over universities that has nothing to do with the actual necessity to know history for what it is, right? That stays on you. And so those will be hopefully crushed as well, because at this point, as we were saying before, I believe most conservatives do come actually from a National Socialist background. So for those, we can do really without. So in these standards, you can see in a sense what we mean by affording to underestimate, right? Affording to say, okay, I'm pretty sure, even if there is a risk that this is kind of not 100% clear, that yeah, this is not really the right thing, that I should not think this person is particularly harmful, or even if it is in a way that is a good example to bust for a minute, for example, and not like much of a problem, right? It's how much you consider such a problem. Of course, how much this ideology is threatening, and there is something wrong with that in the first place. but it's also about being, in fact, capable of spotting that problem. And so at the beginning, you see, with history, as we've seen, it's this kind of elevation that at the end of the day makes the thing. That the elevation is useful because you have to go through a path. You literally have to climb there, and you know how mixed, how dangerous the thing is at the beginning when you still can't distinguish the thing anymore. Then you're at a certain level where you distance yourself from the average, and therefore you just meet with occasional threats, and most of the times you're actually just appreciated for what you say, because most people just say, oh, look at that person, he's talking about things that I like to know and to listen to, and therefore should support, and hoping that he will continue. So that's more or less how we try to bring further the thing, right? And it's always more complex in a sense, because it's also about the topic in itself. It's also about the knowledge that exists. There's already been written how we should relate to it. Unfortunately, we can't quite dominate it all, right? So in all this thing of overestimating and underestimating, there's always to consider this, that there is not really like a standard knowledge, let's say, you on the basis of which you can measure somebody's development. Let's say there is, but knowledge, let's say, is just the fact in itself. What makes the quality there is how these facts are concretely put together, right? How they're articulated in a theory, and how powerful this building is, right? So in there, of course, you can meet a person who is dramatically developed in one field and not maybe knowing so much about the next one, but still that person, first of all, is more likely to understand also the other field in a way. Obviously less, but kind of has an understanding of the complexity, or of an idea of the complexity that presents. So even if he doesn't know much factually in terms of knowledge, doesn't mean that he's not able to frame that knowledge once it gets faster than a profane person. But in general, you shouldn't make this mistake, that is to say, underestimating somebody just because he or she doesn't know about one specific thing, right? Knowledge is so wide that criterion basically doesn't make sense per se. Of course, there are things that are more important and therefore should be known. More likely, you can actually see indeed how our academies do not quite are not bright in this sense. They do not create people with a comprehensive education, knowledge, cultivation that is capable of, in fact, of having that broader synthesis, so that you can expose your own specific field of expertise to other understanding that is able to connect it, right, and to make it applicable in different contexts, right? This doesn't happen anymore, and that's serious, and that's how bad it's become. But at the same time, it doesn't make any sense to say, okay, one person doesn't know one specific thing about a period because therefore is an ignorant. That's what mostly young students do when they see, for example, it happened to me too, when they see professors making a mistake, for example, that they think, oh my God, how is a professor able to make a mistake? And you know why they believe that? Because of course, the mistakes sometimes are really bad, right? I can tell you lots of them that were bad, and some of them were actually even really bad in the form that it wasn't exactly old knowledge. It was about that kind of important things that you should know, and also the kind of level of development that is required to understand complex things in other fields. So it's better to talk to specific experts about specific topics most of the times, just by caution. So don't overestimate, indeed, in a way. But because the student thinks that that knowing history is just knowing a lot of things, and doesn't see yet that hierarchical theoretical system that is needed morally and scientifically to frame all that knowledge. That is the most important thing. So the professor can forget a date about an important event that you can find in any history manual, but still may know that event in a dimension that you have no idea of yourself, simply because you haven't even began to learn anything about that, right? Sometimes it becomes even nominalism, right? How many times people still complain because one uses the term Byzantine, right? Without understanding properly the historical context, say better, the historiographical context of the term Byzantine, right? Why we still use it, and why there is something called Byzantinistics that is, still called like this. The major experts in the world about so-called Byzantine history. That is to say, knowing that that those were Romans as they were, and making you feel the need to criticize, because that's the only thing, for example, I've been ever criticized about Byzantine history. That's quite kind of eloquent in that regard. To say all the time that that's wrong, that only tells you, at which of the one or second grade of university studies, second year of university studies you are. Because literally by the third year, if you're still stuck in that, like, there is a problem, right? There, you already belong to the group that doesn't make it. And this is really a serious thing, right? And a good indicator, I can tell you. That is to say, not understanding the semantics and the meaning, the approximation, and the necessity, also the practicality, right, of using this term. Necessity, okay, as I said, nothing is necessary, but I say necessity felt as a, just not saying the medieval Roman Empire, so being something more concrete that also has a much broader meaning than just the empire, the Roman Empire per se, in that terms. It's something that goes far beyond a person that thinks that there are crazy people in the world who decide to use the term Byzantines because they're ignorant, because they don't know that those people are Romans, right? I still laugh when I smile, say better, even though it's annoying when I get these comments that, of course, do not make it to the public, because they don't bring any form of intelligence to the discussion, given also that I not just have, I don't know how many, like 40 or 50 videos about Byzantine history at this point, but also properly videos that are dedicated, right, something like 4 hours in a row to discuss the term Byzantine, right? So that's the scale when you can say, yes, I don't need to talk to that person, right, to have a debate, because again, if you don't even know those things, I don't need to tell you, and I already did, by the way. So just check my work, which is something that you should do with every historian that you want to quote, to criticize in the first place. Otherwise, that's not really history, and that tells you also methodologically how early in stage in their studies these people are. But again, the problem for most of those people is not the nominalistic obsession. It's properly the fact that they have malice towards other people. They don't want to tell you that because they care about the Byzantines, or they know actually anything concrete about them, right? Those people that correct you, they don't even say they're Romans, they are Eastern Romans, as if Eastern Romans ever existed. That's also an asinine mistake. There was never such a thing like an Eastern Roman Empire, nor nobody that dare called itself an Eastern Roman Empire. So you're making it even worse than what you're trying to correct. And you see, this scale of these are things that I acquired over time, but I didn't know at the beginning myself, but that I eventually learned and assimilated. I framed within other knowledge. I didn't even have to make the effort. It's just something that came along the way, right? And when you know that such a position is the only position, you know that thing is like a mosquito in front of an elephant, right? And it doesn't quite have the consistency, the specific weight to the mass to pose any kind of relevant addressing to the same. So this is properly the force of moral, of the fact that you learn morally from even the problems that, such as in this example, derive from using in a broader sense, in a scientific historical, popular, cultural, whatever historiographical context a term rather than another, why, how the term formed, why it's still used, what does it mean, what were the benefits, what are the pros and the cons, what is the effect. This is part of a comprehensive system that, of course, provides you with the motivation and the strength for going out there and saying, yes, I still use the term Byzantine because, albeit I know it didn't fit to the time being. It doesn't at the time. It doesn't actually mean anything with the reasons that, in fact, most people have no idea of, which it's still actually a good idea to use, right? It's like, and again, if until one doesn't get there, doesn't understand why it is, and again, I explained this why, and this happens, right? So, I don't have to repeat myself about the term Byzantine, but it's also the, I don't know, this is nominalism, but there is also the criterion of authority. Say, lots of people say that this is the case. Maybe lots of PhDs or the entire scientific, that doesn't mean anything. We've always been wrong. Like knowledge evolves, science evolves. To pretend that there is a consensus, when people come with statistics of 20 years before, I said there is scientific consensus. What scientific consensus? Lots of things have changed in 20 years. What consensus are you talking about? You see, and even if it was the last second consensus that you received on your phone from all the international community for you to debate me, the question is, still, do you actually take that just passively without actually understanding what it is? That is to say, not just scientific communities in the past was wrong, right? There was a time in which, I don't know, racism was at the time believed as a scientific thing. There was there are many instances, even the same goes for law, by the way, all things that changed were wrong and that we know that kind of didn't work. They did have a context. This is true. And so today we could have that context and people not really realizing that, right? So there is a difference between Darwin and Spencer, but Spencer had a bit more of a fortune in defining how eventually social Darwinism had to be properly conceived. So, and lots of people have kept believing these things, even at levels that brought to, mass genocide and all this. So the question there is realizing that, of course, we are fortunately at a stage of scientific acquisition that is very advanced, that it's not likely for anybody to be just to have the answer that the majority of experts in that field do not have. But to underestimate the nuisances that emerge from the confrontation between all these various experts, and not realizing that such consensus is still an approximation, because it's not just that there are different schools, groups within that consensus, but simply every single person actually believes a different thing, is dangerous, because it doesn't acquaint you with the complexity of reality. It just makes you think that, it's just because somebody says that, that's how you should. It doesn't make any sense, right? And of course, we should accept that approximation at some point. Hell, if I have a something serious going on with me and I have to go to the hospital, it's not that I have to check whether the doctor who is curing me has bought his degree for somewhere. I just with all the risk that derives, I hopefully I have a decent sanitary system here, but let's say it doesn't mean even in there that I don't know, and I know also because I see the thing from the within, from my family, all these things, that there are doctors and good one, right? Good in the sense of you don't have to be excellent. I've never heard them bragging about that, but let's say knowing what are the mechanisms that stand even in there behind medicine, in an administrative sense, right? Not the conspiracy theories of the big pharmaceutical houses that have to make money. Well, yes, like that's what basically everybody does, right? So if you find a problem with that, justice is not the bigger one that you have in the world, and still, what are you actually doing yourself to be different than that? You should explain first, right? So that's another thing. But in general, it's about still a rigged system, and that things can go wrong, that medicine is not perfect, that it's still actually very, very primitive, and that still there is properly a philosophy of life and mortality that today doesn't quite fit the reality even of science and medicine that we often don't understand. Think about what people generally think about abortion for reasons that are eventually political. They, from a strictly biological point of view, are quite evidently something else, and still, people say, okay, well, it doesn't matter. How doesn't it actually matter, right? That's an actual person you're killing. But so, what are your standards there, right? And how did they are also dramatically easy to debunk if you have any regarding to that topic, right? It is true that the world happens in a different way, that people are going to do bad things and dysfunctional things, and that's real as well, and you have to take that in consideration, because otherwise you would become an ideologist yourself. But at the same time, this doesn't mean that the thing cannot be improved on a base that goes beyond the same ideologism we're mostly fed by. So do I underestimate even the top expertise and competence? Actually, I do. Let's say I underestimate it on the base of the standards that the same science has, right? So you don't have to be anti-science to contest the scientific community consensus. On the contrary, you may be actually a very demanding, but rightfully demanding person, maybe even an expert in that field, and I can tell you, because in theory now I topped that myself in my own field, and I did realize it was a dramatic incompetence and lack of interest and capacity in my specific field of specialization that is still an issue. I mean, I'm talking about the same military historical stuff that we discuss every day. So regarding certain things, even there, I obviously don't know even a tiny bit of all the things that have been written. I don't know, medieval warfare is immense. But even just, the 14th century, still have to study a lot and a lot and a lot. And haven't even reached remotely a consistent fraction of the wall. And nor did others, because this knowledge, by the way, is cumulative. It's written by different people. It's not organic. That's the other problem that we're confronted by, and that with increasing with increase in historiographical production is becoming a problem, even just methodologically speaking. It is to say, how can a person can start to cover everything that has been written, and especially things that have been written by so many different people. People who write manuals are bringing some approximations that are very funny and easy to see, right? Because when you are an expert about something, and you realize that the manual writer is maybe just an expert in his own field, but he's going to make this broader explanation. He's bringing his own bias in the thing, and of course there are older versions of that story that have already been historiographically debunked. And why? Because that guy, it's normal. It's impossible for him to know everything, just as it's impossible for you. So being wary, but also exposing yourself to this situation is the only way to distinguish between the way the time you should underestimate or overestimate certain people's historical knowledge. In general, I must say that, at least from my standpoint, I would be very honest with you, and you understand this just from this video, from others in general at this point, if you are a regular follower, that I don't have a great opinion of the average person in terms of historical understanding, as much as many other things. I feel myself like, of course, an average person who just has cultivated that specific interest, and I feel terribly ignorant about so many other things, so that I know that I topped a part of things that kind of are important to know comprehensively, but let's say this doesn't make me any it can make, yes, it does confer me some maybe greater capacity of framing new knowledge and understanding it and having a deeper and kind of more refined understanding of especially political, social, military issues. But the applicability of that is limited, especially considering that I'm expert just on something like early 14th century warfare, so not really something I can spend for fighting the next war consistently, right? Of course, I study von Clausewitz, I study the Krieg, and people, again, there don't even know what it is. Sometimes there's this oblivious culture regarding to the great pillars of Western civilization is utterly appalling. Even in there, because also they've been misled by authors that have incarnated perfectly the academic decay during the 20th century regarding such important topics. So yeah, I kind of feel a bit better, but because I just I spent many years studying, right? And this still presents me with some moral problems, such as the fact that I have a great theoretical knowledge at this point, but let's say the practicality of what I'm talking about, namely war, most of the times, I realize I don't have, and I don't have in a way that I suspect that, my understanding is kind of solid because I tested it many times historically, but that I'm also, of course, biased, and I can, in this sense, become ever more capable of spotting my own bias, but in a way that becomes ever less bearable. Right, so don't think it's easy to bear this all, that there is such a dramatic qualitative improve. Sometimes you're too beyond to be understood, even at certain levels, and not just because most comments I get here show me that, of course, listening and understanding are two different things, and that I may be the responsible for it myself, but in the way I explain. But it's properly, you have to find a field of application for this, which is not easy, which is a problem for also very, in a world that doesn't appreciate that kind of understanding more than much, right? So this is another issue. It's mostly a market, it's a broader issue, but let's say it's trivial to complain on the fact that historians are not particularly considered particularly useful in general, and I don't even deny that. I mean, that even as part of the category, I don't. Again, as I said before, of all human groups, I have essentially a negative opinion. So, on average, then it's the individual that has to stand out, but even there may be an additional confusion in attrition regarding, let's say, friction stemming from the reasons why we don't understand each other. We were not able sometimes properly even to sympathize or to properly understand. I believe mostly it's properly about understanding. It's not sympathizing in the sense that we should sympathize in an abstract sense. It's about, nor because, as we've seen, our moral standards may be very, very distant, but it's fundamentally about it's as if, the world wasn't ready yet for certain things, and it's not being ready for quite long right now. The same von Clausewitz that camps here, my avatar that is looking at me right now on the screen, from the screen, is telling me that there is still a purpose anyhow, never to surrender in that sense. That's exactly where the hardness, the difficulty, the thing of it all, of the effort of making it is, right? We can't pretend to go on without taking risks in this sense, and we have to be consistent about our own choices. Like von Clausewitz gives us a very lucid vision of how to cope with the unknown, the unpredictable, with the incalculable, and it turns out that our moral force and our goals and our rationale are exactly the things that can make us go through that. Not necessarily, it's not could be necessarily satisfactory to make it, but it's still the best thing you can do to do it, right? And so on the underestimating part, I think we have covered to the concept. I'm sure there is something else I wanted to say. Let me think now. Yeah, I mean the evil, right? Still, I haven't stressed enough. The knowing when to say a lie. I think we are presented today with. I think the pandemic has showed this, right? Has showed this in ways that because I generally sympathize, as you know, with governments in the ways they have to cope with problems. But those definitely are reflective, as we've seen, of the people. So if you have ignorant people, the government is going to be better overall than it's going to be the most rational part of the country. But in a sense, doesn't mean that the evil that lays within the people is not reflected in the government itself. So when you see a lot of dishonesty, of cowardice, of lying attitude, all these things, you know that those are real, right? They're not a matter of let's say of personal, subjective understanding. It's properly about an attitude that is revealed scientifically in the way things are not properly told the way they are, right? I think I told you more than once that I'm pro-vaccines. I have no problem with that. I think they're super safe. I got them. I have problems with other things, with the ways that they've been enforced. I have that I also understand, especially in countries that have to support a very heavy sanitary burden, that also bring other people who are in line to get cured. That is connected to not to be serviced. That is different countries. There are of course different reasons for that too. So people say you shouldn't use that to impose somebody else something else. But we also have to be very practical in things and not just idealistic about that. So, but it's the proclivity to emotionalism, to alarmism, to this sense of gloomy, inescapable situation that is actually not represented by reality, right? Yes, this is a serious thing that has happened to us, but now the vaccines are here. Everybody can get vaccinated. Everybody should get vaccinated. Everybody cannot be vaccinated forcibly in total, like the whole population, but realistically. But it's the attitude that the government and the people have had towards each other, and they are the same thing, as we've seen, two faces of the same coin. That betrayed the cowardice, the weakness, the laziness, the incredible moral poverty and inadequacy and lack of capacities that has been shown here, right? And that is something somebody's going to capitalize upon, this weakness. We knew that this system would have been agitated by it, right? When people say, yeah, there have been some economical adjustment, but let's say you may never know through attrition what is going to happen to a community, what turns things can take, right? People will believe, no, it's all okay, right? Because even economically there's nothing to worry. Well, yes, economically there is not just economics. There's not just the economy. There is politics. There is the eternally underestimated. There is politics. There is what there is in person's mind that doesn't have to correspond, and that we cannot calculate. We cannot we cannot predict, right? In time, even if we did, we wouldn't know how to take action accordingly. Right, so we are floating into the darkness in this sense, but it's always been the human condition, and by this point we should have understood, or at least remembered, because we began to forget it, because we emerged from very difficult times just recently in the history of mankind, right? Up to 100 years ago, things were dramatically different. That's the standard condition, that we should simply have the strength and capacity to look forward, and starting from the individual capacity, There are a lot of people saying, well, it can't even just be solved by wishful thinking. Of course, there has to be a material base. There must be some, but let's say the only persons that can make the only thing that can make the change is persons. Matter doesn't do it alone, right? So the great fans of the revolution are the ones who are saying that no, the capitalism will enter in crisis, all these things. There will be some important changes, but it's not the confidence in which this is said. It reveals the incompetence of it all. It reveals how much we underestimate the possible and the concrete, even when we actually know that something has to end at a certain level, that things cannot ever remain the same. But it's exactly the moment in which you may not realize that things are changing in ever different ways that cannot that go beyond let's say just a pool of options, right? There is a beautiful phrase from Clausewitz talking about war that says something like, war is more than just a color changing chameleon, right? Meaning that it's not just that's what most people, I presume, are looking at war, politics, or society altogether, humanity, as just a superficial indicator. Reality is something that operates on dimensions that we fundamentally can't even understand truly from a scientific point of view. And so how do you think that what is going to happen can even be remotely, you can adapt to that, you can work to that, but how do you know how it's actually going to happen, right? How can you have that confidence in the prediction, right, when it's so difficult even for something so limited as any human interaction can be, right? So never be fooled by the fact that you are part of this, that you're not part of the system, let's say, and that you somehow are the master of everything that is going to. It's not quite the case. The only thing that you are in charge of is truly yourself in what is going to happen, but not because you can decide everything that is going to happen. So that is also run to repair, right? So when thinking about history, it's really a moral question and a scientific one. I can't distinguish it anymore. I can't distinguish science from morality anymore, right? It may sound kind of banal as a concept, but you would be surprised by how people just say, just do this because it's science, but this is no politics, or this is not something else. It always has that kind of influence, and it's always going to be used by somebody in ways, again, that are also the outcome of which, if any, are still by itself unpredictable. And yet there is so much about this that again, I mostly arrived to it, I must tell you, not much just through history, but through von Clausewitz. Because the von Krieger gives you that vision that in fact is so difficult to accept, right? It's not difficult to understand. It's one of the simplest theories that, they're not simple, or okay, they're complex, but they're not difficult. Or even if they are difficult to understand, it's because they require a lot of studying, but as a theory itself, it's crystal clear in everything it says. It doesn't actually present you with major, difficulties of interpretation. It's most of the literature that revolves around it that make the fuss, actually, it's of people that misunderstood the work, and so it needed other people to fix it and to create a debate that if you had just actually read the work, you would have not actually made. Okay, that's not really to read, but to study. But say, so if you want to make yourself a favor, even in that sense of standards, let's say, of what is, you see, overestimation and underestimation are also a matter of, as we've seen, that kind of You have to calculate. It's also mathematical in a sense too, whether it's worth it or not. But you don't have in reality a way to say mathematically whether that's worth it or not. You have to decide yourself, and you have to decide on the basis of experience. That's also what the Clausewitz theory is about. And for Clausewitz provides you with a logical and dialectical method to demonstrate properly what this means practically. What is the dimension of what you can dismiss and what you can't? What effect does this have in practical application? Which is, in my opinion, the single most important thing that, in that sense, has been this might have been the greatest work ever in terms of properly of scientific reading of reality, even in its simplicity, because again, it's not much about the complexity of the work in itself or the effort that it takes to study it, but quite the effectiveness in the approximation that as humans we can carry out in that work. And if you wonder why that happens, it's because of course of the motivation that pushed the man to do that. Right, we are all human, in ways that are basically the same. If that person wrote the thing and understood those things without a pregressed system that can be compared to his own, the reason is that because he went through things that today we're not habituated to go through, fortunately, anymore. And if you know from Clausewitz's life, you know what I'm talking about. For making such things emerging clearly, right? So that helps you because it makes you understand how most of the times it's all our fault if things go wrong. It's because we insist on things that do not have a real an attitude with reality per se, and that we insist of being kind of the monofactorial explanation or the at least the most important thing emotionally speaking. And it's really not, right? But for today, I think we stop it here. I was glad to talk about this. Like most videos I've done for the Historian playlist recently have been really, I haven't liked them more than much, right? It was me trying to fix something, some new ideas. This idea here today, I said, I don't want to make this video. Instead, I liked it because I think I nailed certain points that I hadn't. You see, I grow myself when I make this video, so they are important after all the history ones that I make, because they make clarity. They allow me the possibility to lay out, to articulate this ideas openly, and to not just tell you where I am at that point, but also properly to show how the mechanism occurs. And it's more useful than one thinks. These I'm not sure whether these are the best videos I make, but properly they're the ones that make me feel, this is not just yet another filler to another playlist, right? Of just because you show that you talk about many things about historical topics. Those are important. Without those, I couldn't do these videos either. But at the same point, I should concretize those acquisitions, and I hope it does work in a way, because it's important in the first place just to think importantly in a way that satisfies the need of understanding that we have. Recently you asked, want to know what's my worldview about that. Well, today I didn't really talk about that. It's something, if you want, simpler, more, even, it could be captivating. Maybe I make another video about this thing at some point soon, but this sets some other boundaries. Anyhow, for today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.